Hello everyone, welcome to the Mayday Paintings channel. My name is Blake and today I'm going to take you through my process, start to finish, for making this pet portrait. Let's get started. I'm starting with a erasable colored pencil in a color that I don't mind if it mixes in with the paint or shows through. So that color is pink. Before drawing on the wood panel, I've done a couple studies to size. Since this is 8 by 8, it's not that hard to make a full size practice. What I did with the tape there was mark the edges of the panel so I can put it back in the correct place if I move it, since I'm recording. Later I'll be turning it upside down and sideways to be able to position my hand better and to check proportions. The plain wood panel is prepared with some clear acrylic gesso. I used a couple coats, and then later when I started painting I noticed that the paint was soaking through the gesso a little more than I wanted to. So my new strategy is one layer of gesso, then a layer of matte medium to seal it a little better, and then a second layer of gesso. The gesso also leaves kind of a gritty, sandy texture, so after each layer of gesso I sand it smooth with a fine grit sandpaper, usually 400 or 600 grit. You don't want too coarse a sandpaper because you don't want it leaving marks on the surface. The gritty texture comes off pretty easily, so you only need one or two real light passes. In the practice drawings I did, one was a little too big and one was a little too small, so I'm trying to get a good medium size that fits well on the board. I'm not going to go into too much detail with this because I just need to map out where the major shapes go, and any errors can be corrected when I get to painting. Here is a shot of my palette with the colors I'll be using. It's essentially black and white with some burnt umber and titanium buff to add warmth, and alizarin crimson for the pink of the tongue. I'm using a palette that's a homemade Stay Wet palette that I made out of a Ferrero Rocher chocolates box. My strategy for a painting like this is to start with the darks and then work toward midtones and grays, and then last I'll do light areas and detail. So I like to kind of block everything in at first and kind of give myself something to respond to. I'm thinking in layers, like what color needs to be put down first, so when I paint detail on top of it, it's all going to fit together. So now, since the light in the reference photo is coming from the left, I'm starting to block in a lot of the dark values on the right. The brush I'm using is a long, flat synthetic brush, probably like 3/8 of an inch wide. It says number 10, but those are all, vary from brand to brand. This is nothing special, just bought in a multi-pack of brushes. And it has golden synthetic bristles, which I think I probably like the best. I'm erasing a colored pencil guideline. I think that was to make sure I line the ears up. So now I'm going to start blocking in some of the lighter values and trying to get a good base layer over everything. Some painters like to fully render a small area of their painting, like one at a time. For example, like painting the eyes all the way first so that they're finished and then moving on. I'm the opposite, where I like to start with a roughed in painting and then kind of slowly work around the whole thing and bring the whole painting to finish at the same time. That also allows me to fix any drawing mistakes I make, because I don't usually get the likeness down in my first practice run or even when I draw it on the panel. So there was kind of a jump here because I forgot that my camera turns off after 12 minutes. From here on out, I usually remember, and there's not such drastic jumps. What I'm doing here is just coating the surface I'm painting, or the area I'm painting, with matte media, because like I said earlier, I was having problems with paint kind of bleeding through the gesso. So with a quick coat of matte medium over the dog's face, I stopped that problem. So now I'm going to start taking my first swings at some of the detailed areas. I usually like to maybe start around the eyes or nose or mouth and just kind of start rendering the more detailed stuff, you know, like gums and teeth, or maybe the pupils or nostrils, just to kind of see what it looks like. And that also informs me if there's things I need to fix. One important thing when you're doing a portrait or just trying to get a good likeness of your reference or model is, if something needs to be fixed, that you just go ahead and repaint it. Sometimes the quickest way to fix something is to just kind of start over. And I don't mean start your whole painting over, but if you notice that a really nice eye you painted is too big or in the wrong spot, just paint over it and do it again. I think I probably painted these eyes maybe like 2 or 3 times over the process of this painting, and here shortly I'm going to move that nose over and I think make it bigger, because at this point the dog looks more like a husky than a corgi, so I'm going to have to make some moves to correct that. So I think I'm painting the nose here for the first time, and then later I'm going to totally repaint it to put it in the right position. And the same thing with the eyes. The brush I'm using here for detail is a Blick Master Stroke. I think it's a number 2, so it's not too small. This is one I've had for a few years, and if you wash it out and let it dry, the bristles look all splayed and beat up, but somehow when you put paint on it and give it kind of a twist on the palette, it will come to a usable point and shape. It's one of those brushes where you might buy a new brush to replace it, but then the new brush doesn't work quite the same as the old one, so you just keep using the old one. And then here, to lay in some of these white values, I'm back to that long flat. I don't usually use a lot of different brushes for the majority of a painting. I usually stick to maybe 2 or 3 for most things, and then I'll pull in a reinforcement brush for specific things. So now I'm going for those light values, and then I'm going to be working back and forth for those nuanced gray fur tones. Here I am struggling actually with kind of the eyes and nose. I know it doesn't look like the dog in the picture, and it's still kind of husky-like. So here I'm trying to figure out what I need to do to make it look specifically like this dog and not just, you know, any old dog. So you see me moving that eye over, and pretty soon I think I'm going to start working on that nose too. So I'm just trying to get the likeness. That's why I have my phone pulled up right next to the painting, so I can easily compare. Through the majority of the painting, the photo reference is on my computer, just to the side of the screen. But for this painting, since I struggled a little bit more with the likeness, it helps to put the reference picture right next to your painting. So here we're at the kind of critical reconstruction surgery of the nose, that it's going to start looking more like this specific dog and less like the husky, like I've been saying. So after I've worked on a detail spot like eyes and nose for a while, it's nice to go to kind of a less tight spot, like maybe the fur around his neck or up top, or maybe the fur on the ears. It's the funny thing about working with some cheap brushes is sometimes the ferrule or the metal part comes off of the wooden part. I think I just taped this one, but I do have a little bottle of glue for when this happens that I keep next to my painting station. It even happens with more expensive brushes sometimes too. I think maybe I live in Colorado where it's really dry, so the glue probably shrivels up and lets go. But usually if I glue them again, they don't come undone. So I'm really trying to go for that white and finalize the silhouette here. You can see I'm trying to block in that dark in the fur there. So now that I got the silhouette pretty much where I want it, I'm going to put in the background. I mix the background color on a separate palette than what I'm using for the fur, just because I don't want any of that teal to get into the fur colors in the regular palette. The background color helps me kind of work back and forth to define the edges and fix the edges when I need to. But now I'm back to trying to figure out these details and slowly bringing different areas to finish. So now I am starting to put some detail into the nose. Dogs' noses are actually kind of complicated and hard to paint and draw. Just because of how kind of the nostrils wrap around to the side and curl under and don't really connect to the middle part, and then how the middle part, is bisected, has that line in the middle that runs down to the mouth, and then there's the top plane, is flat on top but then wraps around into the nostrils. So probably the first time I drew a dog's nose was over 15 years ago. The first pet portraits I think I ever did are like, what is going on here? Like, you're not alone. So one of the most important things when you're doing fur, but especially an animal which is covered in fur, is to pay attention to the direction the fur is growing and to try to mimic that with your brush. You also want to choose a brush that mimics the shape and size of the piece of fur you're making. So, like for those big clumps under his ears, I want to just try to find a round, pointy brush that I can get those big clumps in one stroke. The inside of dogs' ears are another place where you have a lot of complex shapes and a lot of different translucent areas and opaque areas, and a lot of different colors and a lot of different stuff going on. So now I'm laying in some dark areas, and I'm probably putting them in a little darker than they need to be, just because I know I'm going to build up texture on top of them, and I want to make sure I have enough contrast so I don't have to paint too much dark back into the light. A lot of those fur areas I probably will be painting back and forth 2 or 3 times just to try to get the right textures and the right subtle tones of gray and the right shifts in value as it wraps around the face. So these gray areas I'm putting around the eyes too are a little darker than I see them, but I'm going to build up the texture on top of them. So now I'm going back into the eyes themselves. On my reference photo, I've probably zoomed in quite a bit, and I'm looking for any little shapes of different color. You can really see when I put the highlights in how it comes to life. Sometimes I'll save the highlights toward the very end, and sometimes it's just kind of a nice little check-in, like if you put the highlights in, does it start to look alive? You can see I just widened the nose significantly, trying to really push it and trying to get that likeness of the specific dog. With each little adjustment, that's what really starts to make it look like this dog and not just some random dog. So pay attention to the little things. I think what I noticed was where the edge of the nose lined up with the center of the eye, and I noticed that it wasn't quite going over for far enough. And it looks like, I wasn't happy with that eye, so I blacked it out. I don't think I'll get back to it for a while. That's probably because when you put down like some black paint like that, you just want to let it dry so you're not mixing a bunch of gray swirls instead of painting shapes. So I'm going to be working on the fur for a while and let that eye really dry before I go back into it. So here I'm trying to use as opaque white as I can. Acrylic doesn't always lay down opaque the first time. A lot of times it actually is kind of translucent, even the whites, so it might take a few layers, but just make sure if something's supposed to be a really bright opaque white, especially a highlight, that if you need to put that in 2 or 3 times that you do it. I also got a little jar of white acrylic wash by Liquitex, which I'm experimenting with to see if that is any more opaque than the regular opaque white that I use, which is just titanium white. Usually I'm using my whites by Golden, if that makes any difference. They're both good, As long as you're using artist quality paint, it's probably going to treat you right. So you can see I'm just kind of working back and forth on the gray. I'm using that probably size 2 brush, trying to get those clumps of fur in one stroke. I think that little ridge under the ear stays darker than it needs to be for quite a while. Where if you are close to it painting, you don't notice it, but if you take a picture of it, it looks really dark. So eventually I do fix that, but it takes me maybe not looking at it for a night and then coming back in the morning to notice how dark it is. So you can see I've flipped it on the side to probably help me get those strokes a little more conveniently. And a lot of times I will spend a lot of time with a painting on the side or upside down to just try to trick my brain into forgetting about trying to make it look so much like a dog and just trying to record the shapes and tones that I see. What I really like about using acrylic paint is how versatile it is. Because you can use it kind of like oil paint and put it on really thick, or you can use it more like gouache or tempera. One of my favorite artists is Andrew Wyeth, and he uses tempera, which is basically pigment in egg. I forget if it's the white or the yolk. Might be the yolk. But basically, like how Andrew Wyeth paints, is he just builds up layers and layers of texture to give his paintings like this sense of, you know, depth and detail. And I try to do that with acrylic, or at least I kind of tend to do that. I'm trying to incorporate more of a kind of alla prima technique where you just put down some bold brush strokes, but when I get into detail I kind of tend to like to work back and forth in more of that Andrew Wyeth style. So it's kind of a blend of both. And what's nice with acrylic is you can do that. You know, you can work really thin and use more water or more medium, or you can use more paint. And you don't have to mess with, you know, eggs in Andrew Wyeth's case, or oil mediums and smelly, toxic stuff. So, all right, so I'm going for this eye again. Might be the third time I'm at least putting the highlight in the eye, but it's important to, you know, just fix it. If it needs to change it. So I'm looking for all the little shapes in the eye, any color variations with maybe some pinks or grays, putting a slight little brown in for the iris, just as much detail as I can, and I'm trying to put down some good brush strokes and shapes. So finishing the nose, I think this is probably the last time I painted it. After making those adjustments, I was a lot happier with the likeness. It just looked like a husky for so long that when I finally figured it out, kind of had that breakthrough moment. Just made me feel a lot better about it. So I'm trying to build up that opaque white and kind of define that slight shift that happens as the nose goes around to the right side of the face, our right, dog's left. And trying to get all those really subtle shifts in value in the nose. What's difficult about it is it's basically going from black to dark gray and then you have highlight areas, and it's also textured, so you have to put kind of the stipply texture on it and then figure out where the highlights go so that it looks right. And usually a dog's nose is wet, you know, so you have kind of a whole lot of different things to deal with dog noses. But it's a good challenge, and once you do it a few times, I think you just kind of know what to expect. Here I'm trying to simplify those brush strokes the best I can, because I want it to look kind of effortless, you know, like I just did it all in one go and just kind of carved them out in one pass. That's the goal, and usually it takes a few times to get it to look like that. You can see how I put the brush kind of vertically in my hand too to get the right shape. As you use brushes, you start to kind of intuitively know what shapes they make when you hold them at different angles. And your hand starts doing all sorts of different things to get that shape to lay the paint down with. So just watching my hands kind of interesting here. You can see I'm getting really dark under the neck, or in the neck, under the chin. That's so I can start putting in some of those strokes of white paint later. I'm letting it dry right now, going on to a different spot, but kind of giving a gray base to build upon. So I'm trying to be exact as possible with these shapes on the side of the head. Just looking for all the places where gray turns into white and where it defines the muscles in the skull under the skin. All those little things, if you can get them in the right place, they add up to just heighten the likeness and the realism. So I'm trying to be as exact as possible. So where the light's hitting the most direct is where it's going to be most opaque white, and then as the face turns or the little shape turns and goes away from the light, that's when you're going to start seeing those translucent grays and variation, and you're going to get, you know, more of the individual hairs and all that. So now I'm kind of going back into the neck. Once again, trying to just make single strokes that look like those clumps of hair, and paying really close attention to the direction and how those two major, sections of hair kind of interact with each other. This is a point where it starts to get fun, because I think I've figured out the likeness of the dog. I'm happy with that, so now I'm just trying to make everything else look as good as I possibly can, and try to have fun laying down some thick areas of paint. So really, the painting's mostly monochromatic, except for the pink areas in the mouth and ears, and then kind of the warmer tones for the brown. So there's not really a whole lot of color I have to deal with here, which is nice. But it is tricky trying to put the warm and cool grays in the right spot. In the reference picture, there is some sort of reflected light color on the dog's left side of his face, but just so it wasn't confusing, I kind of left that out and just rendered it in the gray tones. It's important to translate your photo reference and not just replicate it, because having, I see it as pink, like some kind of pink reddish tones on one side of the face might not make a whole lot of sense when you're just isolating the head like this. So it's important to use your artistic sensibilities to make the picture stand well on its own. Putting those highlights on the tongue is really satisfying too, because that's another place where it just kind of pops to life. You put those really opaque white highlights. When I do highlights, a lot of times I'll put the white paint on like a plastic or maybe enamel surface like a plate or something, just because when you use like a stay wet palette, it could get diluted with the water, or it could also have some other pigments seep into it. So when I get to the point where I need like opaque, bright highlights or bright white, I just want to make sure I'm using fresh paint and I'm getting as much just pure paint as I can. Probably here too, when I'm putting in this fur, I'm trying to probably pull out of a fresh puddle of white paint as much as possible and make sure I'm not mixing it with any grays or anything on the palette. And also probably cleaned out my water at this point too, because if I want really clean opaque white, you don't want any other pigments mixing into it from your water. So it's good to use clean water for clean paint, basically. So now I'm kind of fixing the edges with the teal color. Again, the teal color is on a different palette, just so it's not mixing in with all the grays and whites and stuff. It also is a good reminder to, just keep everything separate and clean. I probably had a different water container for the teal color, so that's why I'm bending in front of the camera more, is because I probably had that palette on the ground and had to pick it up and put it back down. I want to make sure I'm not mixing teal into my gray tones, because they're really subtle for this painting. You don't want, everything to start mixing together and getting all goofy. Those little furry edges are really fun to do. I probably have like a little 0 brush now. It's the same kind as that number 2. Just a little smaller. Again, not like super tiny brush, it's just a single 0, and it's still, about 3/8 of an inch long. I don't like really short brushes because I like having a little bit longer bristle that I can kind of twist into a point on the palette. From here on out, it's just real little stuff, mostly, you know. I'm trying to get in all those little fur details that kind of tie it all together and add a good layer of realism. You can see, like I said before, that edge between the dog's right ear and his forehead is just a little too dark. I will tamp that down eventually. So just paying really close attention to how those ear hairs and hair clumps, what direction they're going. I'm trying to get the cleanest brush strokes I can. Because really I don't want to have to do this more than once because I'm building it up in layers, and if I mess up the top layer I have to readjust the bottom layer to start over again. So if I can, you know, measure twice, cut once, as the carpenter saying goes, it'll save me some extra work of having to redo the underlayers. Those little ear spots are fun to do because those are the things that I would think as an owner you really notice that are really specific to your dog. So the camera is either zoomed in so it's a little blurry, or I don't know. I don't think it's out of focus. I think I just zoomed in here so you can see me painting this nose. I didn't actually move the camera closer. It's just zoomed in the video editing software. So maybe in future videos I can actually zoom in with the camera so it's not as blurry. But you can still tell what's going on, getting in those little eye shapes. And see how I'm turning my brush to get the shape I need. I'm not sure what the movement's from. It's probably from me leaning on the canvas or the panel. And my desk isn't, you know, 100% immovable. You know, it kind of sways a little bit. Just really refining those shapes. And then those highlights, those opaque highlights. I remember in a painting class once, there I go, I softened up that edge. But I learned that you have to really make sure you look at your opaque white highlights when they dry, because I had an instructor, I turned in a still life painting, and that's something I got marked down for. Even though I knew I used some pure paint, it just dried and wasn't quite opaque and needed a couple more layers to really get it opaque. So I always remember now. I'm back with some teal. I flipped it upside down just so that what I'm painting is on the right side. I also turned my reference photo upside down. So you can see how I'll put in kind of those gray details and then I'll put white on top of them to kind of blend them in. Then one more pass on this fur, trying to get the right value for that texture, and then trying to simplify my strokes so it looks like I did it right the first time. Also, I really like cutting into the edges with the background color. It's kind of something I picked up when I tried digital painting that I really like. Use the background color as kind of a eraser. Well, I think we're about there. Put in those white fur strokes. Modify a couple places that just need to be opaque white. A few more of those little edge hairs in. Try not to put my hand in the paint I just put down. Here's a fun part. Another part you really want to get done on the first try is putting in those whiskers. You get a thin liner brush, twist it real tight, get a really nice point. Make sure you got some real liquidy, fresh paint. Sometimes I use a little bit of glazing medium to make sure it flows. And that's it. Before we deliver it to the client, we have a couple more things to do. First is to add a couple coats of Liquitex satin varnish. So I'm just applying it with a 3/4 inch synthetic brush and trying to get it nice and flat and even. The last thing I'll do is add a hanging wire to the back. So I am marking about 1/3 of the way from the top, and I'm just using a couple of eye screws. And on my Leatherman tool, I was using a pokey part of it to just kind of have a little indent to get the screw going. I sped up this first one because it was really hard to get in. I put a little bit of glue on the tread so that it helps it not strip out of the wood, and just adds a little bit of longevity to that screw. That's just white PVA glue. And then adding the wire, just putting it through the hole and wrapping it around, leaving a little bit of give so you can hang it on a nail. The last thing I'm doing here is just clumsily removing this tape,
because people seem to like that. It's not as cool as on a watercolor painting, but it is exciting to see it all finished. I also signed and dated the back so she can remember that I did it. Here is a shot of my workspace if you're interested in seeing that before we wrap up. That's it for this video. If you would like to commission a pet portrait, you can email me or message me on Instagram. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to my channel for more painting content. See you next time!